The cops humiliated and robbed an elderly woman right on the street. They had no idea who her son was. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The morning sun crept over the horizon with the kind of warmth that promised no comfort. In the worn-down part of town, where the sidewalks cracked like the hands that built them and paint peeled like old wallpaper left too long in the sun, a small wooden house quietly came to life. The creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the measured hiss of a kettle on the stove, none of it was rushed, none of it chaotic. Everything moved to the rhythm of age and memory. Wilma Norris had always been an early riser, 82 years old, but still upright, still sharp-eyed, though her knees groaned in protest with each step. Her morning ritual never changed. She rose with the sun, dressed slowly in the same tan cardigan she'd worn for years, and made herself a single cup of black coffee. She didn't own a television, didn't check her phone for notifications. She didn't own one of those either. Her house was quiet because she had long since learned to live with silence, to let it wrap around her like a second skin. She stood by the window, holding the warm cup close to her lips, and looked outside. The street was empty, save for a few cats scavenging near the trash bins. She studied them for a moment, creatures that moved like ghosts, ignored by all unless they made a mess. Wilma understood that. There was something about being old, being still, being alone, that made people forget you were even there. Today was pension day. A small check issued by the state that allowed her to keep the lights on, refill her arthritis medication, and if she budgeted carefully, buy fresh bread that wasn't half stale from the discount rack. It wasn't charity. She had earned it, every cent, through decades of raising children, nursing a dying husband, and holding together a family on the edge of collapse. But the young clerk at the social services office wouldn't know that. To him, she would be just another number in the system, another slow-moving figure in a line that never seemed to shorten. She placed the empty cup in the sink, slipped on her walking shoes, old leather soles worn nearly flat, and grabbed her cloth shoulder bag. She checked its contents 3 times. ID, medical paperwork, small notepad, pen, habit, not fear. Then, without a word, she opened the door and stepped outside. The streets were warming now, heat rising from the pavement in waves. She passed by closed storefronts, faded signs, and boarded-up windows that whispered of better times. The neighborhood church bell rang once at 8 a.m., as it always did, even if no one paid attention anymore. At the social office, the line was longer than usual. The air was thick with sweat and tension. Wilma stood among mothers with tired eyes, elderly men on canes, and war veterans whose medals hadn't kept their dignity intact. No one spoke much. Words were precious here. The people in line had been taught by experience that speaking up only led to delay, or worse. When it was finally her turn, the young man behind the bulletproof glass didn't look up. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. "Name?" he asked flatly. "Wilma Norris." He typed, squinted at the screen, and eventually retrieved a small envelope from the drawer beside him. He pushed it through the slot with the same expression someone might use to hand out coupons for expired milk. "System was running slow," he said without eye contact. Wilma nodded politely and took the envelope. She didn't open it there. She never did. Instead, she placed it carefully in her bag and exited the building with the same deliberate pace she had arrived. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, baking the sidewalk with an indifference that matched the faces inside. She walked along the side streets, favoring the shaded parts where overgrown trees offered scraps of mercy. Her knees ached. Her fingers, thin and veined like tree roots, clutched the strap of her bag tightly. She wasn't afraid of being robbed. Not exactly. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested she was worth the effort. That was the trick of poverty. You disappeared in plain sight. She had nearly reached the corner store where she usually bought her bread when she heard the sound of tires skidding against gravel. A white police cruiser lurched to a stop beside her. Dust rose in a sudden cloud, stinging her eyes. 2 officers stepped out. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't greet her. The taller of the 2, with short blonde hair and mirrored sunglasses, approached first. His name was sewn into his chest, Officer K. Weston. The second stayed near the car, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, Officer M. Dean. Weston looked her over like someone inspecting a discarded coat at a thrift store. "Where are you headed, ma'am?" he asked, voice neutral, almost pleasant, but only almost. Wilma straightened her spine. "Just going home?" Weston nodded. "Mind if we ask what's in the bag?" She hesitated, instinctively drawing it closer to her side. "Just personal items." Without waiting for permission, he reached forward and took hold of the strap. Not roughly, but not gently either. She flinched. Dean stepped forward. "Standard procedure, ma'am. We've had reports of counterfeit bills being circulated in this area." Wilma said nothing. Weston opened the bag, peered inside, and withdrew the envelope she had received not 15 minutes earlier. He opened it, pulled out the bills, 5 crisp $100 notes, and held them up to the light. He snorted. $500. Not bad for a sweet old lady." Dean laughed. "Bet she was headed straight to the liquor store." The words didn't sting. Not anymore. Wilma had been called worse. Had lived through worse. But the way they said it, like she wasn't even there, planted something in her chest. Not pain, not shame, something colder, heavier. Weston slid the money into his own pocket. "We'll need to take this in for verification," he said casually. "You know, just in case." "But," she began, his eyes snapped to hers, cold, flat. "You're free to go." They turned, climbed back into the cruiser. The engine roared to life. The tires spat dust again as they pulled away, leaving her standing there, her bag now empty, her dignity peeled back like a scab. No one had stopped. A man, walking a dog, crossed the street to avoid her. A young woman with a stroller pretended to be on a phone call. A teenage boy made eye contact for half a second, then looked away. Wilma stood still for a long time. Not from shock, not from rage, but because something inside her had shifted. She could feel it, a tightness behind her ribs, a calm that felt unnatural. She walked home, not faster, not slower, just differently, like each step was counting something. Back in her kitchen, she sat at the table and stared at the wall. There, in a modest frame, was a photograph. A man in uniform, handsome, stoic, eyes that saw more than they let on. Carlos Ray Norris. Her son. People knew the name Chuck Norris, knew the jokes, the movies, the myth. They didn't know the man. But she did. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. On it, a number. One she hadn't dialed in 20 years. Under it, in handwriting that was not hers, "Only call if they touch what they shouldn't." She stared at it for a long time. Her hand trembled, but not from weakness. Then she reached for the phone. No words were spoken. She didn't need to say a thing, because he already knew. The line disconnected the moment she released the phone. There had been no goodbyes, no reassurances, no promises. Just a low breath on the other end, and the quiet click that came after. In the silence that followed, Wilma Norris sat at her kitchen table, hands folded in her lap. The house around her was still, not just from the quiet of morning, but from something deeper, like the stillness before a storm, the charged emptiness that builds before something ancient stirs. She didn't move for several minutes. She didn't need to. The call was made. The signal was sent. Nothing more was required. Thousands of miles away, tucked between the timber ridges of northern Nevada, a modest cabin stood isolated among pine trees and old hunting trails. It had no road signs leading to it, no formal address, and no mailbox. To the outside world, it looked abandoned, just another forgotten relic from a forgotten time. But inside, everything was clean, precise, ordered. Carlos Ray Chuck Norris was already awake. He always was. Sleep was no longer a habit, but a courtesy he occasionally extended to his body. This morning, he hadn't granted it. Something had been bothering him since just after midnight, though he hadn't yet understood what. He stood in the center of a modest kitchen, barefooted on oak planks he'd sanded himself. A pot of water boiled quietly on the stove, though he hadn't made tea. The only light came from a thin beam slicing through the wooden slats of the window. It touched nothing directly, just illuminated the dust. He heard the phone ring once. That was all it took. The old rotary sat on a shelf above a copy of The Art of War, and a framed black and white photograph of a young Wilma, beaming in the sun beside a small boy with unruly red hair and knobby knees. He walked over and picked up the receiver. No voice greeted him, no crying, no pleading, only a breath. And that was all he needed. He said nothing. Then he hung up. Within 5 minutes, he had shut down the perimeter sensors, closed off all camera feeds, and locked the double deadbolts on the cabin's main door. Not for secrecy, for respect. This place wasn't meant to be violated, even by memory. He packed a small duffel bag, clean shirt, gloves, utility knife, satellite phone, not much else. He didn't bring a gun. He didn't need one. At the end of the hallway, near the storage closet, there was a mounted hook on the wall. For decades, it had held only one thing: a small velvet pouch tied with cord. He untied it carefully, opened the pouch, and removed the contents: a United States Air Force service badge and an old photograph folded into fourths. On the back of the photograph, Wilma's handwriting. Only call if they touch what they shouldn't. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he placed the photo in his shirt pocket and stepped outside. The old Ford F1 150, parked beneath the shed, started on the first turn of the key. He drove down the dirt path slowly, letting the gravel crunch beneath the tires. It was mid-morning now, but the sky over the desert was overcast, giving the world a pale, almost bruised hue. He didn't take the highway. He didn't need GPS. He drove by instinct, memory, and timing, tools far sharper than any machine. Hours passed in silence. He stopped once to refuel at an unmanned station, paying in cash. No one saw his face beneath the cap. No one recognized the quiet man in worn denim who didn't ask for directions, didn't speak, and left without a word. As he drove deeper into Texas, the landscape changed. It was familiar, though it had shifted over the years. Towns once full of life now stood partially hollow. Schools closed, churches boarded up. Corners that once had barbershops and cafes now held pawnshops and payday loans. The town he was born in was no different. He arrived near sundown. He parked the truck 4 blocks from his mother's home, hidden behind a row of cypress trees that bent in the wind like elderly dancers who hadn't yet given up. He sat for a while, engine off, listening. He listened to the silence and to what was missing from it. He knew this place, knew it in the soles of his feet and the corners of his jaw. It had raised him, ignored him, underestimated him, and finally tried to forget him. But forgetting someone like Chuck Norris wasn't possible. Not completely. He had always been the kind of man who stepped out of memory the moment he was needed. He walked, not quickly, not with fanfare. He passed the old grocery store where Wilma used to buy peaches for cobbler. It had changed owners 4 times. He passed the gas station where his older brother used to wash windshields, now a laundromat with broken doors and flickering lights. Everything looked the same. And yet, worse. On the edge of the block stood her house. It looked exactly as he remembered it. Yellowing paint, slanted mailbox, wind chimes that hadn't sung in years. He didn't knock. He stood outside for several minutes. Through the window, he saw her, asleep in a chair, blanket pulled over her lap, hair wrapped in a scarf. She looked peaceful, but he saw what no one else could, the tiny trembling in her fingers, the slight clench of her jaw, the way her hand rested on the armrest, not loosely, but as if bracing for something. He walked away, not inside, not yet, not until he had seen what had been done. He spent the next several hours walking through the town, mapping it again, not just the buildings, but the people, their pace, their posture, their eyes. He knew how to read fear, knew how to read dominance, knew how to read systems where abuse wasn't shouted. It was structured. He stopped at a 24-hour diner where the night cook was a man he hadn't seen in decades. He didn't speak, just nodded once. The cook stared, then slowly nodded back. That was enough. Later, he returned to the truck and retrieved a small black notebook. Inside were blank pages. Tomorrow he would start filling them, but tonight he sat under a rusted awning across from the police station, just out of sight. 3 squad cars parked out front. One of them had a dent in the side panel, recent, a sign someone had resisted something. He waited, watched, and then, around 2:17 a.m., he saw them. 2 officers stepped out from the side door, laughing. One slapped the other on the back. Chuck didn't need to hear what they said. He recognized their faces, and more importantly, he recognized the way they moved. Too confident, too unbothered. The kind of men who thought they were insulated. He sat still as they got in their cars and drove off into the night, patrol lights dimmed. He didn't follow, not yet. He returned to his mother's house just before dawn. This time, he knocked. Once. She opened the door as if she had never gone to bed, eyes calm, body upright. They didn't speak. She simply stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the table. She brought him coffee. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. She placed a single photograph on the table. A picture of the 2 officers who had taken her money. She pointed to one and whispered, "That's the one who smiled." Chuck looked at the photo. He blinked once, and then, quietly, placed it inside his notebook. Wilma watched him. Her hands no longer trembled, because now she wasn't alone. Now she had written her letter. And her son had answered. The town woke slowly, as it always had, not with the bustle of ambition, but with the rhythm of routine. Shutters creaked open, coffee pots gurgled to life, radios murmured in kitchens, and people prepared to step into a day they already knew too well. The streets smelled faintly of burnt oil and dust. Dogs barked at nothing. Mailboxes clicked. And somewhere, behind the fogged windows of the police department, Officer Weston poured himself a cup of black coffee, same as every morning, completely unaware that his day and everything he trusted about his place in the world was coming to an end. Chuck Norris was already awake. He had been since 4 a.m., seated at his mother's table studying the quiet geometry of the town from memory and from instinct. The layout hadn't changed much. The people had. The faces were different, but the structure, the invisible skeleton beneath the streets, the unspoken lines of power, fear, and silence remained. He could trace it the way a fighter traces muscle memory. Every blind alley, every unlit intersection, every parking lot that served as a stage for unaccountable control. He didn't speak much to Wilma that morning. They had exchanged everything necessary the night before, without drama, without ceremony. Their bond had never needed filler. She gave him space. She always had. At 5:30, he left the house and began to walk the town alone. He wore a simple gray windbreaker, jeans, and an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Not to disguise himself, he wasn't hiding, but to avoid unnecessary attention. The people who mattered would recognize him anyway. Those who didn't need to. He started with the old barber shop. It used to be owned by a man named Joseph White, who had once refused to cut Chuck's hair because of military cuts only. That shop was closed now, but Chuck still looked through the broken glass, not out of nostalgia, but analysis. It had a clean sightline to the street corner where his mother had been stopped. That mattered. Next, the hardware store, run now by someone too young to remember Chuck's high school wrestling days, but old enough to glance sideways at a stranger lingering outside. Chuck didn't go in. He just looked up at the camera on the corner of the building, tilted downward, off by exactly 12 degrees, just enough to miss anything happening on the sidewalk below. He took out his notebook. One red mark. 2 blocks later, he stood in front of the bank. Same stone pillars, new logo, 2 security cameras mounted at opposing angles, both supposedly covering the street intersection. He pulled out a pen light and clicked it toward the lens. No reflection. Dead, or disabled, another red mark. By 6:15, he had walked the full patrol zone described on the precinct's public website. He noted where squad cars tended to park, where officers took long coffee breaks, and which corners were consistently left unmonitored. At 7:30, he stopped by a small diner that had changed names 3 times since he left town. He sat at the counter. Didn't order food, just coffee. The waitress was about 60, hair tied in a bun, hands rough from years of washing dishes and wiping sticky counters. She looked at him once and froze for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I know you," she said quietly, "from back when you still had freckles." Chuck nodded. "You still serve apple pie?" She grinned. "Only on Thursdays." He left a $20 bill on the counter and walked out. No more needed to be said. By 9 a.m., he'd assembled a mental map of the town's new skeleton, zones of neglect, patterns of abuse, choke points for intimidation. And then he found what he had hoped not to find, a blind spot behind the social services office where a dumpster was angled just perfectly to obscure a stretch of wall where his mother had likely been first approached. The camera above it was working. The light blinked faintly, but when Chuck accessed the public municipal network through a patched Wi-Fi signal behind a closed vape shop, he discovered that the feed for that camera had been offline due to server transition for 4 weeks. Another red mark. But Chuck didn't believe in broken cameras, only in systems designed to look broken when needed. By 10:15, he had 3 addresses. Officer Kyle Weston, lives alone in a one-story ranch-style home with a security system that advertised a company no longer in business. Officer Mark Dean still lives with his parents, parks his squad car 3 blocks away to avoid HOA complaints. Lieutenant Gregory Rusk, supervisor on the shift when Wilma was stopped, and likely the one who approved the non-intervention when the body cam system flagged a request for review and then immediately archived it as low priority. 3 names, 3 patterns, 3 weak spots. Chuck didn't act immediately. He returned to his mother's house, sat with her for lunch, a tuna sandwich, a glass of milk. They ate in silence, as they often had in the past. She didn't ask what he was doing, but when she reached for his hand and touched it, just for a moment, he saw the faint tremor return in her fingers. He squeezed them gently, just once. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the horizon like a stone into dark water, he went to the local barber shop again, but this time not to observe. He waited. At 6:47, Officer Weston pulled into the lot across the street, same as he did every Thursday. There was a 7 o'clock poker game in the back room of the VFW hall. Weston wasn't a member, but he liked to show up and supervise, especially when the players were undocumented workers or young men with unpaid fines. Chuck watched him step out of the cruiser, tug at his belt, and adjust his badge like it was a costume piece. He carried no visible weapon, just a taser and his authority. Chuck crossed the street quietly. No rush. He approached from behind, letting his footsteps blend with the hum of nearby traffic. When Weston turned, Chuck was already within arm's reach. There were no words, just a movement. A precise flick of the wrist that disarmed the taser. A shift of weight that placed Weston on his back before he even realized his legs had left the ground. And then, nothing. Chuck stood over him, silent, calm. He removed a photograph from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on Weston's chest. It was a picture of Wilma. Next to it, he placed a folded piece of paper. No threats, just one sentence. "You didn't just take money. You touched something sacred." Chuck turned and walked away. He left Weston on the pavement, conscious but breathless, heart pounding, not from pain, but from something worse. Recognition. He had looked into the eyes of a man who did not need permission, a man who would never warn twice. Later that night, Chuck sat inside his truck parked at the edge of the cemetery near the old train station. He went over his notes again. The second name, Mark Dean. Tomorrow. Not vengeance, correction. Because this wasn't personal anymore. This was restoration. The next morning arrived like all the others, quiet, heavy with heat, and dulled by routine. The town stirred half-heartedly, unaware that something had shifted just beneath its surface. Officer Kyle Weston did not show up for his shift. The official reason, scribbled into the report log, was unspecified medical condition. The real reason sat silently behind his eyes, wide and disbelieving, as he lay in bed that morning, replaying over and over the encounter that had happened without sirens, without witnesses, without a word. His pride, not his body, had been broken, and he couldn't stop shaking. Chuck Norris wasn't concerned about Kyle Weston. Not anymore. He had already faded from the page. Now the pen moved to the next name, Mark Dean, the junior officer, younger, sloppier, arrogant in a way only those newly baptized into institutional power could be. Chuck had seen men like him overseas, green, overly confident, easily impressed by their own uniforms. They followed orders not because they believed in the system, but because the system made them feel invincible. He watched Dean's routine the day before. It was unstructured, impulsive. He drifted between zones, chatted idly at coffee shops, made stops without logging them. Chuck had already memorized the car, the gait, the twitch in his left hand when he lied. He also knew the pattern. Dean parked 3 blocks away from his parents' house every night at the end of shift. Around 10 p.m., he'd make a detour to the liquor store, buy a 6-pack of beer, and loiter out back for a while, smoking, pretending to be on the phone. Chuck arrived early. He waited in the alley between a pawn shop and a boarded-up laundromat shrouded in deep shadow, one boot resting against the wall, arms crossed. A single street lamp flickered weakly above him, as if debating whether to do its job. At exactly 10:12, Dean pulled in. Same spot, same walk. He didn't notice anything, didn't feel the cold air shift, didn't question the silence that seemed a bit too thick. He moved towards the rear of the liquor store, one hand juggling his keys and phone, the other holding the bag with his purchase. Chuck stepped out. Not fast, not slow, just precisely. Dean saw him only when it was too late to pretend he hadn't. He straightened his posture, sneered slightly, like a reflex. "Can I help you, sir?" Chuck said nothing. Instead, he took 2 steps forward and handed Dean an envelope. A plain, unmarked envelope. Dean hesitated, laughed nervously. "Look, if this is about—" Chuck's hand shot out, not to strike, to hold Dean's wrist firm, unmovable, and then, with the other hand, he pulled the envelope open himself, revealing 5 crisp $20 bills, a total of $100. "Recognize this?" Chuck finally spoke, voice low, even. Dean scoffed, tried to pull back, but the grip tightened. "You took $500 from an old woman," Chuck continued. "You laughed while doing it, and then you threw away the footage." Dean's face froze. "You don't remember?" Chuck tilted his head. "That's fine, I do." He released the officer's wrist. Dean staggered back, rubbing his arm. He reached for the taser at his hip, but Chuck had already disassembled it. When, Dean would never know. The device was now in pieces on the pavement. "You're not hurt," Chuck said, "but you're going to leave this town, you're going to resign, and you're going to disappear." Dean opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but Chuck stepped closer. This time, he didn't touch him. He simply looked into his eyes. And Dean saw it, the storm, the control, the silence honed into something sharper than any blade. Chuck turned and walked away. Dean never followed. By noon the next day, Mark Dean's resignation letter was submitted electronically. The official reason: pursuing other opportunities. The truth never made it into the report. But Lieutenant Gregory Rusk noticed, and he didn't like what he saw. 2 officers down, no formal complaints, no paper trails, just silence, and men who couldn't explain why they suddenly feared their own shadows. Rusk had been around long enough to know when something didn't add up. He accessed the station's internal logs, reviewed patrol car activity, cross-referenced timestamps. There were gaps, small, precise gaps that didn't show misconduct, but something worse. Someone who knew exactly where not to be seen. That night, Rusk arrived at his home to find something waiting for him on his porch. A manila folder. Inside it, copies of internal complaints, body cam footage with corrupted tags, and a printed transcript of a radio exchange from the night Wilma Norris had been stopped. His voice clearly authorizing no escalation and immediate log archival. The last page had no threat, just a single sentence. "The system you protect is the one that protects cowards." Rusk didn't sleep that night, but Chuck wasn't done. Because justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about reminding the system what consequences looked like when the court failed. That's why, later that week, he made one more visit. This time not to a cop, but to someone who had stood by silently. Officer Harris, a desk sergeant, never laid a hand on Wilma, never issued any orders, but he had reviewed the footage, laughed quietly, and moved on. Chuck found him in the parking lot behind the precinct. He didn't strike him, didn't confront him. He handed him an envelope. Inside, the exact amount Wilma had lost in 5 neat $100 bills. Chuck spoke only one sentence. "You're the one who still has a choice." Harris stared at the bills, then looked up. Chuck was gone. What followed in the days after wasn't a revolution. It wasn't loud, it wasn't televised, but it was movement. The tension in the station shifted. Officers began double-checking their logs. Body cams stayed on longer. Complaints were no longer dismissed out of hand. A poster appeared on the bulletin board in the staff lounge, an old photo of Wilma Norris smiling beside a young boy in uniform. Pinned beneath it, a handwritten note. "Sometimes the one who doesn't shout speaks loudest." By the end of the week, 3 senior officers had requested transfers. 2 internal affairs reviews were reopened. 1 camera system was replaced. Chuck never filed a single report. He simply walked through the system like it was made of paper and tore away just enough for the light to get in. But he wasn't finished. Because justice wasn't about retaliation. It was about remembering. And the town had forgotten who Wilma Norris was. It was time to remind them. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the same way as before. It was no longer the silence of neglect, of absence, of nobody watching. It was a heavier silence, measured, cautious, attentive. People in town didn't know exactly what had happened, but they felt it. A shift, subtle but unmistakable, had rippled through the concrete and wood, through the dust-covered windows and faded street signs. Something old and invisible had been cracked open, and now everyone looked over their shoulder a moment longer than before. The air, once dry and indifferent, now carried something else. Memory. Wilma Norris rose early, as she always did. The morning sun came through her kitchen window the same way it had for years, slicing in narrow bands across the linoleum and settling on the old photo frames above the sink. She stood with her coffee in hand, looking out the window, but not with the same tired distance that had marked her mornings for decades. This time, she stood with her spine straight, her breath calm, her eyes alive. The world outside looked unchanged. Same sidewalks, same fence posts, same garbage bins rolled back from the curb. But it felt different. As if the town, without quite knowing why, had begun to treat her like someone whose name belonged in history, not just in paperwork. She stepped outside around 7 a.m., wearing her modest tan coat and the scarf her eldest daughter had sent her last winter. She carried her cloth bag, though it was nearly empty. It wasn't payday, and she wasn't going to the social office. She just wanted bread, real bread. And the walk felt different now. People didn't pass her by the way they used to. They moved aside gently, gave her space without urgency, nodded as she passed. No one spoke, not directly, but they looked at her, and this time they didn't look away. At the small grocery store near the corner of Elm and Riker, the cashier, a thin man in his early 40s with a tired beard and quick hands, greeted her with something more than routine. "Mornin', Mrs. Norris," he said. She paused. For a moment, she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. It had been years since anyone used her name without being prompted. She nodded, cautious but not unfriendly. "Mornin'." He reached under the counter and pulled out a paper bag already folded. Inside was a warm loaf of bread. Not the discounted, nearly stale kind, but a fresh one, crust still soft. "No charge," he said, and held up a hand before she could respond. "It's already been taken care of." She didn't argue, just held his eyes for a second longer than usual. Walking back, she passed the local precinct. She didn't usually go that way, but today her feet took her there without asking. The building was the same. Beige brick, fading paint on the words "Protect and Serve" above the front entrance. But something new had appeared in the small foyer, behind the glass bulletin board usually reserved for shift schedules and community notices. A photograph. It was hers. An old black and white picture taken outside the Methodist church decades ago, the one where she stood in a summer dress holding a hymnal, smiling with a dignity that hadn't dulled with time. Beneath it was a handwritten note on plain white paper, penned in deliberate strokes. "Sometimes one son is greater than the system." She stared at it for a long time. Not because she was flattered, not because she was proud, but because it had been so long since her existence had been acknowledged in public space without needing to justify it. The door behind the glass didn't open. No officer came out. She didn't need them to. Across town, people whispered. They didn't know exactly what had changed, but they had felt it. Officer Weston had filed for extended leave. Officer Dean had relocated without notice. Lieutenant Rusk, once regarded as immovable, had transferred to a training role in another county. Rumors swirled. Some claimed internal affairs had reopened cold cases. Others mentioned anonymous letters, unseen footage, digital footprints that led to no one and everyone at once. The truth was simpler. Chuck Norris had returned to his mother's town and walked through its streets not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a man who kept a promise. And the town, without a press conference, without an investigation, without handcuffs, had begun to tremble in the space he left behind. He didn't stay long after the second week. One night, without announcement, he packed his things. The same bag he had brought with him. He moved through the house silently, like a man accustomed to retreating through shadows. Wilma was awake. She didn't speak, only watched as he stood by the door, hand on the knob. "You'll be okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I always was." He opened the door, paused, then looked back. "If anyone asks why I came, I'll tell them you came home," she said. He gave the faintest smile, the kind that meant everything, then stepped out into the night. He didn't drive back the way he came. Instead, he took back roads, gravel trails, and dirt paths. He passed by the abandoned barn where he'd once trained as a teenager, punching air and dreams into shape. He passed the creek where his father taught him to fish, and the hill where he buried his dog, Lucky, with his bare hands. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What he had come to do was done. But the town continued to remember. In the weeks that followed, small changes took root. The camera systems at the precinct were replaced, not patched, but rebuilt. Officers began turning their body cams on earlier and off later. Complaints from citizens were no longer casually dismissed. A community liaison was hired, the first in over a decade. People didn't stop fearing the system entirely, but they began to question it, openly, carefully, but without the old paralysis. On the bulletin board in the City Hall lobby, someone pinned a page from the local paper with a new headline, "Voices of Our Elders, the Hidden Pillars of Our Town." Wilma's name was listed first, not with accolades, not with fanfare, just as a presence, finally acknowledged. Once a week, a boy from the high school walked Wilma home from church. She never asked him to, and he never spoke much, But he had seen something change, and he wanted to be near it. People noticed, and people remembered. Chuck hadn't left a trace behind. No digital footprint, no statements, no threats. But what he left behind was heavier than evidence. It was pressure. A quiet weight that settled over the town, reminding them that they had seen something they couldn't explain, but also couldn't ignore. He didn't burn anything down. He didn't call for reform. He didn't preach. He simply returned what had been taken. Dignity, and sometimes that is the most devastating force of all. As the seasons began to change and the leaves turned the color of rust and regret, Wilma sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the horizon. She didn't expect him to return. Not soon. Maybe not ever. But she knew, if the silence ever returned, if the shadows crept back in, if the same old fear tried to steal something from her again, she wouldn't need to write. She'd just reach for the phone. And that would be enough. Because this town might forget rules, names, dates, and slogans. But it would never forget the man who walked in without knocking, said almost nothing, and made the whole world listen. And it would never forget the name of the woman who didn't scream when they stole from her. She just made a call and changed everything. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the next videos on the channel, and don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.